So, I'm going to share with you the saint that I have in my mind this morning. This is a picture. Do I look like her? It's my mom. And she was an incredible lady. She was an incredible musician. She played trumpet and piano, and she sang so beautifully. And her claim to fame was always that once she sang on the radio with Woody Herman in northern New York during World War II, when he was stationed at what was then called Fort Drum instead of Camp Drum in Watertown, New York. Well, my mother, I've shared with many of you, she was raised in this extremely conservative religious family where her parents had started their own denomination because the Assembly of God Church was too liberal. And so when she married my dad, she left that faith behind. She left that church behind, I should say, because she always remained a person of faith. And so when my parents would try to go to church, they could never find a church to be part of because they were always told a negative by my grandparents about whatever church they tried. But it was still important for my mother to raise us kids in the faith, and she did that through music. She made sure that we knew the Bible stories through these hokey little songs that she would make up. I hate to say it, but sort of like the song we just sang. That's so hokey. Oops. But it's adorable, right? So she would have us sing these songs, and all of the old hymns. I still have them memorized, some of them. There's a church in the valley by the Wildwood, In the Garden Alone, all of these old hymns. So even though I never went to church as a child, I knew Christ. I had faith because of my mother. As she got older, my father died when I was a teenager. She was left with two teenagers still at home, and she started her own business, making jams and jellies in order to support us. And she had over 100 varieties of jams and jellies, and some of them were bizarre. Goldenrod, milkweed, and then the more typical elderberry, rosehip, and then the really typical of the strawberry and the grape and all of those. She sold them everywhere, even in New York City on the Women's Exchange. She shipped them, and I remember how proud she was that they were even sold in Idaho and Montana and Oregon, because people would buy them in northern New York and ship them out here. Well, my mother she was incredible. And when she got older and she couldn't take care of herself anymore very well, she moved to Oregon, where we were living at the time. And she provided childcare for Jared and Cameron, my two youngest, so that my kids, those two, never had to know what it was to go to childcare anywhere, because they just had their grandmother loving them. And she taught them the same songs that she had taught me when I was a child. Well, we all have saints in our lives. All of us do. People who have influenced us in our faith, in our journey of faith. So now I invite you, I've shared with you the story of one of the saints in my life who is now part of the great cloud of witnesses, symbolized by this banner. The names the people have written in this congregation, and Ray's name is on that banner already. And this banner will be used again at our Blue Christmas service, where right before Christmas. So, who are the saints in your lives? You don't have to tell details, but I encourage you to name the saints. Who's a saint in your life? Yes? Your great-grandma? Your great-grandma. Joel? Your grandfather. Lee? Your grandmother. Troy? Gladys Collins. You know, Gladys died before I moved to Idaho Falls, and yet I feel like I know her. You're saints. It's okay if you don't name them by name, but shake your head if you agree that we all have saints in our lives. People who have brought us, who have encouraged us on our faith walk, many of whom, most of whom, are now part of the cloud of witnesses. Maggie, would you read the first part of our scripture reading?
Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings to us so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood.
So, persevere in the race. That's what these saints are for, to witness to us. What we need to do is continue on in the faith. Well, these witnesses in our lives, all of them have gone through things in their lives. For the children who came up for the children's story that Maggie labeled as awkward, an awkward story, and yet even our children know that does everything always go perfectly in our lives? They don't. There, even for children, are times when children are upset because they already know that there are bad things that happen in the world. And that's why we tell them these scripture stories. We tell them because they're going to see it on TV. If they're in the room when the news is on, how are they going to put things into context if they don't have these stories from their faith? And so we tell them even the hard stories, because even in the hard stories, there's good that can come from them, as they'll find out later, although you spoiled it. Oh, so in our lives with these saints that you've thought of or that you've spoken about, life has not always been smooth for them. With my mother, she lived through the Depression. She had a boyfriend that she never talked in front of my dad about him, but she did with us girls, with my sisters and I, who was killed during World War II. She lived through abuse as a child. This devout religious father that she had was violent. She lived through the death of my father, becoming a widow when she was still in her 40s, which now I consider really young. At that time, I didn't. So she went through hard things in her life. She went through having to start being poor again and building up a business. What are the things that the saints in your life have gone through? I know that many of you were thinking of Ray, and I cannot imagine seeing him struggle and how faithful he was for 17 years of Parkinson's. What have the saints gone through in your lives? These grandmothers, great-grandmothers, grandfathers. Alice's father died when she was 6 months old. Her mother, Gladys Collins, raised six children all by herself. What have your saints gone through? Yes? So homelessness taught you tolerance, love, yeah, hard life. What have your saints gone through? This could be a much more interesting sermon if you participated. Yes. The death of your youngest brother when he was only 22. Your parents survived that, which my mother did too. My sister was in her early 30s when she died. Yeah. Good. Well, the reason I ask this question is that for the writer of Hebrews, he was writing to people who were undergoing persecution in the early church. They were seeing so many difficult things happening around them and to them. And so the writer wanted them to really look at these things that were happening to them in a better light than perhaps they could have. With these saints in our lives, who they're incredible people, they have been incredible people, they didn't become bitter. They didn't become angry when they went through difficulties in their lives. They were the kind of people who survived and who allowed the changes to happen in their lives so that they were transformed by God to accept and to live through whatever it was that has happened to them in this life. And that we like to think that like these rocks up here, and you've heard this analogy before, I'm certain, is that the difficulties, the things that we go through in life, it's like water or sand blowing against a rock or running over a rock. It smooths out all of these rough edges. That's what happens to us as people. That all of those difficulties, your mother is one who comes to mind. The things that she went through, or the things that all of our saints have gone through, created them to be, caused them to be the saints that they are. That they would not have been our saints if they had not gone through all of those difficult times. We are shaped, or can be shaped, in a positive way by the things that we endure in this life. If we don't become angry, if we don't become bitter by the things that happen to us and to them. And so, the writer of Hebrews encouraged the people who were going through such horrible times to look at it not as God causing those horrible things to happen, but to look at those things as discipline. And to allow that discipline, to think of God as a parent, as a father, and to allow that discipline to happen, not punishment, but discipline. Because as we discipline our children or our grandchildren, we know we do it for their sake, to help them become better people. A friend of mine in a previous church once said to the children at the children's story that she was leading, she said, "You know, I discipline you and I discipline my children because I love you and I want others to be able to love you too." We discipline and are disciplined to improve ourselves. Will you read the rest of the scripture?
Endure trials for the sake of discipline. God is treating you as children. For what child is there whom a parent does not discipline? If you do not have the discipline in which all children share, then you are illegitimate and not his children. Moreover, we had human parents to discipline us, and we respected them. Should we not be even more willing to be subject to the Father of the spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as they seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. Now discipline always seems rather painful than pleasant at the time, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed.
We endure the trials in our lives partially because we don't see that we have another option, but also because of the witnesses who have gone before us and who have shown us that no matter what happens in our lives, we can endure. We can get through it with our faith intact, and that it will make us better Christians, better people, and that we have a responsibility to endure with our faith intact, not to become angry and bitter, but to improve who we are, because we know that we too will be part of the cloud of witnesses, and we have our children and our grandchildren, our nieces and our nephews, all of those who will one day be naming us in a service like today as the saints in their lives.